You may notice an overwhelmingly Christian flavour to proceedings this evening. It was something we were aware of, but we feel that in history it's never been a mistake to assume that one religion can speak for all religions, so we think that's going to go really well for us. I invite Marion Maddox to address this House with her arguments for the affirmative.
Ladies and gentlemen, last week a Victorian primary school principal described lessons in his school as rubbish, hollow and empty rhetoric, and with no value whatsoever. So he closed down the special religious instruction, or SRI, classes. A teacher reported this week who found her son's SRI class taught that dinosaurs never existed, God just planted the fossil record, called the lessons unpalatable, offensive and unacceptable. A third primary school's principal demanded an apology and is now hosting a departmental investigation after SRI volunteers gave her Year 6 children a Bible zine advising girls how to avoid making their nipples a distraction and temptation to men, explaining that wives must submit to husbands, and instructing children never to act on homosexual feelings. She called the material completely inappropriate, against fundamental school values, and said it smacks in the face of everything we do. But none of this is new. The image of religious instruction is at best a free period and at worst utter chaos, complained an Anglican clergyman to the Church's Newcastle Synod, as reported in the Newcastle Herald in 1969. The major churches had already pulled out of providing SRI in South Australia, beginning with the Methodists in 1968. During the 1970s, the Tasmanian, Victorian, South Australian and Western Australian governments held inquiries into SRI, finishing with New South Wales in 1980. All registered familiar frustrations. SRI segregated children by religion when public schools' essence is inclusion. It created organisational headaches as increasing numbers of families and churches pulled out. It relied on volunteers whose main qualifications were enthusiasm and faith, not necessarily teaching ability or subject expertise. It was unfair since minority religions had trouble finding volunteers, leaving their children ill-served, and short weekly visits made it hard to build up any meaningful rapport between instructor and class. The state inquiries advocated, in some cases replacing, in others supplementing SRI with general religious education, in which professional teachers, not volunteers, teach about different religious traditions and philosophies, not just one, as part of the regular curriculum to their regular classes, not groups segregated by religion. Since the mainline churches largely vacated Australian SRI in frustration, hellfire preachers and evolution deniers often filled the void. Conducting surveys and interviews in 23 public schools in New South Wales and Queensland between 2009 and 2011, education researcher Cathy Byrne found that SRI volunteers preferred significantly more conservative approaches to their subject than parents, principals or professional teachers. For example, asked whether they thought the Bible should be taught as fact and therefore accepted without too much questioning, parents and education professionals favoured questioning, whereas SRI volunteers tended towards biblical inerrancy, the questioning-proof view that the entire text of the Bible is free from error of any kind. In almost a quarter of the schools, Byrne found teaching to the effect that students or their families or friends would burn in hell if they didn't believe the volunteers' version. In a quarter of the schools sampled, volunteers distributed creation kits with DVDs and colouring books promoting the idea that God created the world in 6 days and the world is 6,000 years old. Now, defenders of the current system maintain that these are all aberrations. Yvonne Patterson, CEO of Access Ministries, said that her organisation was extremely disappointed by her volunteers' nipple advice Bible zine and would continue to investigate how it happened. But inviting religious volunteers into schools who are chosen for their faith, not educational qualifications, makes it impossible to screen out such travesties before they happen. Instead, bewildered parents are unsure where to go after the event. Complaints to schools get deflected to provider organisations, and they have often declared intentions such as to use public schools as a mission field, Patterson, or impacting New South Wales government schools with the gospel so that many more young lives will be transformed through the Lord Jesus Christ, Access's New South Wales counterpart Gen R8 Ministries. Answering the suggestion that SRI has no place in a secular public education system, Yvonne Patterson wrote in 2011, "I argue that all faiths play a valuable part in shaping and forming our understanding of who we are as individuals and as members of the global village. Research shows that parents and educators agree. So did the committees of inquiry 30 and more years ago. But I can think of no worse way to nurture such understanding than to segregate students by religion, teach them just one religion, and tell them that all other groups are wrong." Well, actually, I can think of one worse way. Segregate students by religion, tell them that the other groups are wrong, and then teach them just one narrow segment of one religion. And that is exactly what happens in the majority of Australian SRI classes. How do I know? Because I conducted a content analysis of the curriculum used by Access Ministries in more than 80% of Victorian SRI classes, and that is also used widely around the rest of Australia and New Zealand. It includes none of the kind of cultural knowledge that our opponents will tell you is SRI's greatest educational contribution. Nothing about Christian art or architecture, no way into the heritage of music or literature. It does introduce Bible stories, but they come with a decidedly evangelical doctrinal spin and an overlay of doctrinal practice, such as class prayers saying sorry to God for wrongdoing, that cuts across claims to be merely passing on cultural knowledge. In the 34 years since the last of the state inquiries, general religious education, non-devotional study about different religions and philosophies, has become standard in England, Ireland, much of Western Europe and Quebec. But in Australia it was implemented minimally or not at all, though some states offer it to years 11 and 12. Our children go to school with, will work and travel and study alongside people of many religions and worldviews. They deserve to learn about their own and other religious and philosophical traditions with the same rigour they learn about maths, history, literature, geography or anything else. When we send our kids to school to learn maths, we expect them to get a fully rounded curriculum, not just somebody's favourite strand of fractions. And we expect them to learn from a qualified professional with several years' expert training in the subject matter and in how to engage kids' inquiry and questioning. Why does religion deserve anything less?
I wonder sometimes at why anybody would take on a job as hard and responsible as teaching for the reward they get in public schools in this country, and indeed in most countries. But people do it because they're dedicated. We ask them, of course, to do a monumental task. We ask them to take our young children, our most precious thing in the world, and we ask them to look after them for 13 years, to teach them, to encourage them, and produce, hopefully at the end of that, a rounded, knowledgeable, civilised young adult. What sort of person would we like to see children emerge from when they come out of school? What are we asking teachers to do? I can't, of course, speak for everybody here tonight, but I suspect that the sort of things that I'm about to say are things which we'd all agree with. We want them to be knowledgeable about the world. We want them, of course, to be able to read and write fundamentally, but to know about the world, to come out with a broader experience of the world than that which they entered. We want them to understand the cultural influences, the nature of our society, for good or ill, so that they can be active citizens and take part in civic debate. We want them to be conscious that they're not the centre of the universe, that they're just one person in a very big world, and that one of the most fundamental skills we'd like them to learn at school is to be decent members of a community and good and honest citizens. We want them to be constructive. We want them to be sharing rather than vicious, destructive or nihilistic. We'd like them to be polite, faithful, courteous. We'd like them to be humble, conscious that they're not the smartest person in the room, they're not the chosen ones, they don't possess a unique insight or superior virtue, that everybody who earns an honest living deserves respect, no matter what they do. We want them to have inner strength and resilience so that when they fall short of their own expectations, as everybody does, when they fall short of other people's expectations, they're not broken, they're not beaten. They know that there is a path of redemption, that they can make amends with those they've offended, and they can always come back from whatever mistake they've made. We want them to seek a path of continual improvement, to be able to think they will leave this world a better place than when they arrived. These are high ideals, but I struggle to see which parts of the formal curriculum, as it's now constructed, really teach this. If they're lucky, they'll get good teachers, they'll get sympathetic teachers, teachers that will take a pastoral role, a nurturing role, and encourage these things in our child. But fundamentally what we're asking is that they come out with the knowledge of what's inside them as well as what's outside of them. And this is where I think religion has such a vital part. Because after more than a century of studies of humanity, and I'm a sociologist by training, so I know the weaknesses, the strengths and weaknesses of the humanities. They actually tell us very, very little at all about what it is to be human. There's nothing that I've learnt in sociology or psychology that can tell me why music touches my soul, why you can enter a concert hall and hear a piece of music for the very first time and find yourself in tears. Why? How does that happen? What's the rational explanation for the thing we call love? It's an intangible and elusive thing, but unless we're extremely unfortunate, we know from our own experience that it's something real. There's a big question in sociology which nobody's been able to solve yet, and that is, how do you explain altruism? What's in it for us to stop for the stranger, somebody we don't know, and help them if they're in pain or if they've been hurt? Evolutionary science would struggle to explain that. But it's a natural human emotion. We think it's a natural human emotion, and when somebody doesn't exhibit that, when somebody walks by and leaves somebody in distress, we regard that as an inhuman act. How do you explain these things? How do you get to understand these things other than by studying something we'd like to call the soul, the inner being, the inner things that make us. And I speak of somebody here who is, I suppose I'd call myself an agnostic, because I believe in keeping an open mind. But when my children asked if they could skip scripture class, I said yes, they could. I don't regret that, because I think at the time scripture was taught very badly, but I wish it had been taught better. So, what sort of world do the radical agnostics or the radical atheists want when they want to exclude religion from our schools, exclude it altogether from the public sphere? I think it would be a very risky course to take altogether. Of course you'll say, ethics is not the sole preserve of religion. There are many ethical, many decent people, many people who live exemplary lives who won't have a bar of religion. But let's not turn our backs on the most important brands that we have. Christianity had been an enduring set of values, enduring set of principles that people have lived by for 2 millennia now, and it would be foolish to write off that wisdom. If we say it's made up, as many of us might suspect it is, that it's not a divine revelation from above, but something that humans have created, then even more important that we should listen to it, because this is the collective wisdom of our ancestors about how to live a life and how to live a better life. How foolish it would be, how arrogant, how hubristic to declare the wisdom of our ancestors worthless and give up. In doing so, we would be impoverishing the world of our children, we'd be robbing them of the joy of poetry, we'd be removing any mystery of their lives. We'd be saying that all you can believe is that which you see in the here and now. They were divorced from their past. They become strangers to their own literary and artistic heritage. So while I have every sympathy with those on the other side who wish for religion to be taught better, we're all in that camp. So my plea to you today is to remember that the motion tonight before us is faith-based religious education has no place in schools. Not simply that bad faith-based religion has no place in schools, because that is something that I'd vote in the affirmative for.
David Van.
Thank you. I might not be your typical atheist. My wife is Catholic. I was a professor at a Jesuit university. I have friends who are priests, and my mentor was a Jesuit. I studied feminism with a radical feminist who was married to an Anglican bishop. I've translated religious texts from Old English and Latin and German, and my novels all focus on religion. The Holy Trinity is central to my most recent novel, Goat Mountain. Dirt focused on the New Age movement, Caribou Island on Anglo-Saxon doom, and the novella In Legend of a Suicide begins with a rewriting of Genesis. I was a religious studies major for my first 2 years of university because I thought this field offered the most interesting and illuminating view into culture, though I later transferred into studies of literature. Understanding religion can help us understand and compare across cultures how and why people act and value in the way they do. And in our multicultural societies now, I think this is vitally important. I have to admit that I come into this debate in fear because I'm not an expert on the subject and knew nothing at all about the history of public policy in Australia until reading articles by some of my colleagues here during the past 2 weeks. I'm also really uncomfortable with the public debate in which both sides have been weighted favorably toward religion. The three of us debating for the proposition actually all support the teaching of comparative religious studies, and Peter and Marion are both members of churches. I suspect I'll be departing from my team on 3 questions. One is whether someone who has faith can teach religious studies. The next is whether the teaching of religious studies in high school or earlier can be about education rather than politics. The third is whether any time before university is developmentally appropriate for study of the subject. Though I'm no expert, and I welcome debate, I think the answer to all 3 questions is probably no. I think someone who has a particular faith, who believes in God in a particular way, will teach comparative religion in a way that is inevitably weighted, and the fact of their belief in any God at all will keep them from being able to think fully about what religion is culturally and historically. In all of our collective experience, there is no evidence for the existence of a God beyond our making. Just as we can deny human involvement in climate change, we can deny the human making of God. But the lack of direct evidence for God is overwhelming, and it's absurd in the face of that lack of evidence to maintain that there is a God. I do love Kierkegaard's and Paul Tillich's discussions of this absurdity as a foundation for faith, but still it's just absurd. I've wanted faith very badly for much of my life, and I write about religion and the making of meaning constantly in my novels, and will never be finished with that. And I agree that religion, or something which has come to substitute for it, like my essentially Buddhist daily writing practice, is the center of most of our lives. But still there's no God. I know this because every representation of God is clearly made by humans, just as representations of aliens most often have a head and 4 limbs. Our gods reflect our humanity. We can see the signs of the making, and the most interesting questions are about why we've so deeply needed gods and continue to need them, and how our progressive invention and reinvention of them over time and through different cultures reflects who we are. These are exactly the kinds of questions that someone teaching from the view of faith most likely will not have, and this is why they should not be relied upon to teach religious studies. Faculty in university religious studies departments in America, in my experience, are usually atheists. They teach an academic discipline with a rigor that would be compromised by faith. They have to be able to talk about the making of God and what that reveals. To give another example, they have to be able to talk about hell as being built and owned by artists and writers, not owned by the church. Hell has had many different architectures, developed by Bosch and Dante, Bede and Blake, and Cormac McCarthy. Someone who actually believes in hell is unlikely to engage fully in this discussion. Religious studies are important for understanding every aspect of human culture, including the arts, and the field is just too important to leave to the faithful. Any religious studies also have to include the history of religion as a primary engine of war and empire and enslavement, oppression and suppression. A feminist perspective on 2,000 years of the church-supported anti-feminist tradition also has to be included, as well as a Marxist analysis and a look at current widespread sexual abuse and corruption scandals. It's difficult to believe that all of this will really happen in schools before university. I believe the curriculum will inevitably be a political battle, and that important aspects of the field will be excluded. There will be pushes for including prayer and denying science, which are habits of conversion. And although churches can be a force which pushes to the left in politics, as I know from teaching at a Jesuit university which had a mission of social justice, the push for religion in schools always seems to come from the right. I'm not sure why that is. I also wonder about the high school mind because of my own experience. I deeply wanted religion in high school, perhaps because of my father's suicide when I was 13. I needed faith and meaning, and though I tried many religions, I ended up New Age. I became a selfish little monster because I believed fully that each person I met was teaching me a lesson toward my own transcendence and was therefore not fully real. I was like a protagonist in a novel with what Nabokov has termed referential mania. Everything in the world referred to me. It was a great comfort to eliminate the meaninglessness of existence, but it was dangerous to believe because belief is small. The faithful mind is a partially fettered mind, forced to travel certain pathways over and over in denial of basic aspects of our experience. And in high school, our minds aren't yet fully developed, so we can more easily become zealots. I know because I've experienced it, and I still remember that mind. Can a curriculum of comparative religious studies at high school help prevent zealotry and fight against evangelism, and also provide a useful look across cultural values and identities? Or will it inevitably be a conservative political tool taught primarily by the faithful, encouraging faith? I think we should be clear that faith in something for which there is no evidence can never be the goal in education, never. And we know that Access Ministries has that goal. I've read Marion's report for Fairness in Religion in Schools, in which she describes the Access materials as unequivocally evangelical. And as Peter has quoted from their website, every day of the school year, Access Ministries CRE teachers are sharing God's love with over 130,000 young Victorians. Their current website makes it clear that they believe they are God's presence in the school. A further example comes from the 2009 manual. The opportunity we have to present the love of God and His Son Jesus Christ to children in schools in Victoria is indeed a wonderful privilege for which we continue to praise God. Thank you for responding to God's call to tell children the good news about God's love for them. This is a crusade to win converts to one particular religion, and crusaders always must be resisted. They are war and everything that is ugliest in human culture. What Access offers is anti-education and has no place, even voluntarily, in public schools with a secular mission. I've focused as generously as I could on the possibility of a real curriculum of comparative religious studies at the high school level, but I think we have to admit that anything earlier than that risks being indoctrination rather than studies on a path toward conversion. Thank you.
Justine Toh.
The last time I was at Melbourne Town Hall, it was for a debate between atheist rock star cosmologist Lawrence Krauss and Christian apologist William Lane Craig. And the vibe in the room was so intense that I remember sitting right there that night and thinking, thank God I'm in the audience and not up on stage. So basically, when I look out at all of you here right now, about to engage a topic that similarly inflames passions, the only thing I want to say to God right now is thanks. I've just got two reasons why, against the motion, I'm arguing that faith-based religious education has some place in public schools, even though I can identify with parents who just don't want their kids to be preached at. But people against faith-based religious education often argue for comparative religion instead, and we've heard that from the team tonight, because they believe that comparative religion won't indoctrinate students. Now, I'm actually really keen on the comparative approach generally, but I also think it's naive to assume that it is any more neutral than faith-based religious education. So this is my first reason why it has some place in public schools. Faith-based religious education is honest and upfront about where it comes from. As far as I understand, comparative religious approaches outline the beliefs and characteristics of each religion without necessarily assuming that any one religion is true. Now, on the face of it, such an approach seems value-free. Okay? Students are simply being taught about the ways that the different religions describe ultimate reality. But I guess I want to know, what perspective does the comparative approach operate from? In lining up the different religions alongside each other to contrast them, does the comparative approach include itself as just another way to interpret reality? Or does it become the measure by which it judges everything else? Now, you've probably already heard of the analogy of the blind men who try to describe an elephant. It gets at the limitations of the comparative approach. You've got one blind guy who touches the tail of the elephant and says, well, the elephant is thin like a snake. And then another guy feels a leg and says, actually, it's very thick, right? An elephant is thick like a tree trunk, and so on. Now, in this illustration, the elephant stands for ultimate reality, and the descriptions of the elephant represent how the various religions grope, blindly, I hope you notice in the illustration, towards ultimate truth. But of course, the only way that this story makes sense is if someone can see the whole elephant. In this case, the comparative religionist. So it seems like it's often the case that comparative religious approaches assume access to the bigger picture that can see all the features and perhaps limitations of each religion, in a way that the various players remain blind to themselves. But such a privileged viewpoint is exactly what the comparative approach denies to every other faith-based perspective. So while such an approach is thought to be more objective, it's unclear to me whether it takes its own biases into account. And plus, it's kind of patronising. Now, some say it's misleading to regard the comparative approach as like a belief system because it just wants to understand the different claims that religions make. It's not interested with the truth or not of any of those religions. But I would say that that in itself is a value judgment that holds that truth is unknowable. And the best we can do, therefore, is to settle for understanding how the various religions attempt to describe ultimate reality. Again, this approach appears to be neutral, but I think it's anything but. I think comparative religion also leaves unexamined the experience of a committed believer, an insider of the faith. I think we'd all agree that there's great value in hearing from people who've experienced something firsthand. So why shouldn't the same be for faith-based education? If I think back to the best teachers I had in school, they didn't just objectively impart knowledge, but were absolutely thrilled to bits by their subject. I think insisting that the best education is impartial gives the impression that it's good for students to, understand Jane Eyre, but if they start to love it, then we've got a problem. Now, this isn't to say that there isn't a place for more objective, impartial perspectives on religion, but to stop there feels inadequate. Some space should be devoted to an account from someone native to the faith, if you like, which is why I think comparative religion shouldn't completely replace the faith-based alternative. Now, another reason why faith-based religious education should have a place in public schools is because ruling it out entirely conveys the message that faith-based perspectives have no place in public life. And of course, I'm interested here, this would put me out of a job if this was the case. I work for the Centre for Public Christianity. But it also mocks true pluralism, where different voices and perspectives can have a place at the table. Now, I really get that people are resentful of Christendom, where Christian voices had the mic for hundreds of years and used that privilege to impose their views on other people. But to insist today that we don't want to hear from faith-based perspectives at all, whether in public or in a public school, well, doesn't this just swap one imposition for another? Additionally, ridding faith from the public overlooks the fact that personal faith motivates people to contribute to the common good. If Tim Costello, for example, could only do faith on Sundays, then the work of organisations like World Vision, which I'm sure we are all glad for, just wouldn't exist. Now, I think we'd agree that education is about preparing kids for life, especially when it comes to making informed decisions for themselves. Well, how are they going to be able to do that if our educational system can't set aside even 30 minutes a week to give such big questions an opportunity to come up? Now, I'm not saying that faith-based religious education should be a major feature of our public schools. I'm just saying that, for the reasons I've outlined, it should have some place. Thank you.
I want to begin with two propositions to argue that faith-based religious education has no place in public schools. First, religion is not nice. Second, religion is not just for children. The first proposition, religion is not nice, is easily demonstrated by looking at the world around us, where so many wars and famines and conflicts still have their origins in profound differences between people of different faiths, or even different expressions of the same faith. The proposition that religion is not nice is demonstrable by reference to the sacred texts of many individual religions. After all, the New Testament reports Jesus saying that, "I come not to bring peace, but a sword, and whoever is not with me is against me." And of course, Christianity centres around that most challenging and difficult of events, the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. It's not nice. The second proposition, that religion is not just for children, is also easily demonstrated by looking at the world around us, where billions of adults engage in rituals and behaviours that express their beliefs and their religious adherence. And of course, the New Testament also reports Jesus saying that, "Truly I tell you, whoever does not receive the kingdom of God as a little child will never enter it." But that doesn't mean that Christianity is only for children. So why do these two ideas matter? I argue that they mean religious education is absolutely essential for our public schools, both primary and secondary, but that they require a religious education curriculum that is critical, comparative and professionally taught, preparing children to deal with difference and the challenges of being an adult. And I want to argue that can't be done through faith-based education. So why do we need a comprehensive general religious education program in public schools? This, as many of you will know, aims to help students understand our society, explore difference and interrogate truth claims. A general religious education program in schools can help us understand key religious concepts and practices, not just the interior beliefs of a particular child, their particular religion or their parents, but concepts such as the 5 pillars of Islam. Why do millions of people go to Mecca on pilgrimage each year? The 10 Commandments. Are they really the basis of our legal code? They can help us understand how the world works. The conflicts in Israel and Palestine, Egypt, Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, the United States of America. Then there's the culture and heritage argument. Who is that woman with the baby in all those European museums? A general religious education program, however, should deliberately explore difference. This is not about some universal values that underline all religions. It's not about a privileged viewpoint that sees all religions as equal and deficient. It's not about being nice. It is precisely about coming to terms with the specificity of difference that drives conflict in our world. So a good general religious education curriculum will improve the capacity for critical analysis of our children and maybe help them discover some of the many faith-based motivations for healing and reconciliation that we so badly need. A good general religious education program will then interrogate truth claims, instill a healthy hermeneutic of suspicion, teach our children to test assumptions, form judgments, make choices, and maybe even see the prophetic possibility of religion, precisely because it's absurd. A good general religious education program will grow mature adults who acknowledge the contrariness of the human condition, our inconsistency and our imperfection, our aspiration for something more perfect, and possibly some humility. So why don't we have such a program in our public schools in Australia? Well, to give you one example, the Victorian Certificate of Education curriculum includes 2 subjects based on religion, taught at over 120 schools in this state. But only one of these schools is a government school. The others are all in the Catholic and independent sectors. That means in the whole of Victoria, there is just one public school that offers a religious education subject at VCE level. But it's possible that we could have such a curriculum. It only became possible in 2006 in Victoria when the Education Act was changed and it now allows for a general religious education program. It was illegal beforehand. Even the teachers' unions who opposed such a change in the 1970s have now come out in favour of a general religious education program. So we could have it. All that we're missing is the curriculum and the training. And it wouldn't be too hard to look to the private school sector or to state schools overseas to find it. So you may be asking, why can't we have both general religious education and faith-based religious education? Well, this is where I'm being controversial. Faith-based religious instruction, in my view, can all too easily cheapen religion by relegating it to the arena of the well-intentioned amateur instructing some children in the very basic beliefs of one religion. I want to argue that religion is worthy of the best teaching, the most professional techniques we have to offer. Faith-based religious instruction is almost entirely confined to the primary school system, and as such, it can demean religion. It turns religious belief into nice stories exclusively for primary school students. It risks becoming a set of fairy tales and childish behaviours, such as Santa Claus and the Easter Bunny, that we leave behind from the moment we start secondary school. Worse, as the public perception of faith-based religious education diminishes, religious believers look increasingly desperate, as if the only avenue for recruiting new adherents is through proselytising children in public schools. Finally, faith-based education taught by volunteers runs the risk of misunderstanding faith itself. True faith can be questioned, doubted, criticised, defended. It can't be taught through instruction alone. It needs education. In short, I believe that religions in general and religions in particular deserve critical scrutiny and are worthy of the very best our education system has to offer. Faith-based religious education can no longer deliver this. Our special religious instruction providers should now be fighting for general religious education, for making this opportunity available to all children in public schools. This is what we wanted back in the 19th century in the churches, when our fear as Protestants was that Catholic teachers might come into the public school system and teach a misguided version of Christianity to Protestant children. It feels now as if replaced that with the fear of some Christians that militant atheist teachers in government schools might actually teach a critical approach to religious belief and behaviour, and therefore somehow suddenly general religious education seems to no longer be the goal. So what would happen if the energy that the churches and other religious groups have invested in what was always a compromise, special religious instruction for half an hour a week taught by volunteers, what if that energy was directed into supporting the development of a rigorous, pedagogically appropriate, professionally taught, multi-faith, general religious education curriculum? It is time to put an end to our childish ways and grow up. It is time to remove faith-based religious education from our public schools. It is time to replace faith-based religious education with a mature, critical and professionally taught program of general religious education.
Thank you, and it's a pleasure to be involved tonight, and it appears that as one who believes faith-based religious education has a place in public schools, I'm joined by the opposition on this. That it's only a question of who and how and the professionalism that's involved. But let me say I believe this both conceptually and personally. The personal experience now 25 years ago was teaching religious education at St Kilda Primary when I started my Baptist ministry there. Conceptually, many people say, well, education's meant to be secular, free and compulsory. And that, isn't it, backed up by the Australian Constitution that separated church and state? We've got section 116 in our Constitution, no religious test of office, no state church, etc. So therefore, what's it doing in public schools? And it's almost a sigh of relief then. All that grief and conflict that religion brings, and we've heard a bit about that, we've actually eradicated. Well, I don't think there's anything to be gained by trying to count up the corpses through religious wars and conflicts compared to the corpses from atheists, from Stalin to Pol Pot. I think that's a dead-end street. As a Baptist, I actually take church-state separation very seriously. I'm proud that the first constitution in the world that separated it in Rhode Island was a Baptist, Roger Williams. Thomas Jefferson was going to have a state church. He was Episcopalian, Anglican. It would be just like England. And it was Virginian Baptists who came and convinced him not to establish a church, to separate religion and the state. Now, I think many of our framers of our Constitution, along with Jefferson, would be surprised if they thought today we're arguing religious education is to be excluded from schools. I think what they were doing with church-state separation was saying, we're not going to protect the state and its organs, schools, from religion. That's a given. We are trying to protect religion, which has its proper part to play, from being manipulated and compromised by the state. When it comes to secular, that means this worldly. Therefore, doesn't it mean excluding religion from schools and the public marketplace? Secular, I think, means the very opposite. It means we won't privilege any religion in the public marketplace or schools. I am glad that the Act that governs us here in Victoria and other states says Buddhist and Jewish and Islamic and Baha'i, they too can come in and teach. I think the fact that it's opt-in, parents just don't, out of lethargy, allow their kids to get religious education. They've got to choose, is actually respecting that sense of pluralism. Conceptually, I believe that any worldview, even perhaps some secular ones, can be argued to be faith-based. Naturalism incorporates an atheistic worldview. It's faith-based, I would argue, grounded in the belief that matter is all there is. Can anyone prove that proposition? Faith-based systems actually are always in contest and maybe are undergirding more of our education when we think it's secular than we understand. So, saying we know what secular means, and we can simply remove faith-based religious education from schools and it's really a done deal, I think is naive. And it's not, though tonight the political heat and battle is about religion, it's not that alone when it comes to curriculum in schools. The debates are always a contest here. Christopher Pyne, as you know, has set up a review of curriculum saying what about the primacy we seem to give into three issues: Indigenous, climate change and Asian culture and facing Asia. I was quite struck when Burnham in the bicentennial year, the year Nick came out to Australia, went as an Indigenous leader and planted the Aboriginal flag in Great Britain and claimed Great Britain for his ancestors and those who had now arrived. I thought it was a magnificent statement at every level. But then he went on and said, I don't think we'll ever deal with the Indigenous troubles in Australia until we have a federal minister who's not an atheist, who gets spirituality. Then he was having a go at Jerry Hand. He was actually trying to say spirituality and faith are profoundly important to Indigenous. Now, I don't want to believe that people who are Indigenous and indwell their spirituality have no place because they're faith-based in our public schools. Where does that take reconciliation? On climate change, we hear people say, well, isn't it just a scientific discussion? Many on the right will say, no, this is a religion. It's New Age religion here, David. And this is a religious urge going on. Many people are acting out of a spirituality that they feel around climate change, again in contest. I come at it from my belief as a Christian that when the Bible says the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, it's saying it's not just mine to exploit and to treat badly. In Facing Asia, that's been put again into the contest. I know that World Vision, a Christian humanitarian organisation, has lots of Buddhist and Hindu and Muslim staff. They want us to take our Christian faith seriously as we give them respect to take theirs seriously, working for World Vision. In Asia, the Philippines is Catholic, Indonesia Islamic, Sri Lanka Buddhist. Many of these countries will say, secular? How can you be secular? For them, they'll say, how do you name a child? How do you have a marriage? How do you have a culture? The developing world and Asia is profoundly religious. In trying to understand this, even atheistic more systems, the communist system in China, We know that the Cultural Revolution so damaged over 10 years Confucianism, that sense of ethics and family and belief, that many Chinese commentators are saying we are troubled now, that is just materialism. The vacuum is enormous. And educators and government, communist officials, are actually turning to the Bible Society to say, can we bring the Bible into communist schools? Funny that there's less heat about the Bible in schools than maybe here in Victoria. Well, whatever these issues are, my personal experience is that we do inhabit and indwell a Judeo-Christian story. It does undergird so much in Western culture, our legal codes, our art, our literature. When Richard Dawkins says, I'm a person who believes religion is nonsense, his question is it true? No, it's not. It's nonsense. Get it out. Nonetheless says, but we need the Bible stories for cultural literacy. Alain de Botton, also an atheist, has a very different question. His question is, what is the meaning of religion? Written a wonderful book about religion for atheists, one of the best books on religion I've ever read, talking about rhythms and rituals, talking about stories and community and education. Well, we indwell, for good or ill, in this country, that story. Formation is always going on. Our children, apart from the half an hour a week of religious instruction, are being formed by the beauty myth, by notions of what success is and beauty is and gender stereotyping is. Formation for primary school students, given our history, is about indwelling a story. Even fairy tales that are grim and awful, and there are some grim stories in the Bible. We know now the point of them. Children being put into an oven and burnt alive, Hans Christian Andersen, told by an adult, communicating a worldview that there is evil in the world and there are bad things and hurtful things. You indwell stories. The Bible stories that I taught at St Kilda Primary, my personal experience, were appreciated, but I had to fight to get in there. They said it's a multicultural school, lots of religious groups, we don't have religious education, we don't want it. I said, can I address the staff? I said to the staff, if they don't know the Good Samaritan and the prodigal son, how will they not only not understand Milton, Shakespeare, but even Manning Clark and his history of Australia? His images, if you've read it, are biblical. I said, I notice you're reading The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. I said, C.S. Lewis and the Christian allegory that motivated that. The teachers said to me, what? They said, no, it's just a fiction story. The teachers had no sense. That's before I get on to Tolkien. Well, these are the stories that I think, when I taught them, and I've had a look at the Access Ministry stuff and where there's bad stuff, and we've heard some of it, yes, then we should be dealing with that. But if the vehicle is wrong, we can actually amend that rather than throw the baby out with the bathwater. These stories, I think, are profoundly important. They're the roots, not just of our culture, but of so many of the people who have inspired me. That's why I believe faith-based religious education has a place in our public schools. Thank you.
On your way in, when you were pre-polled on this topic, 10% of you were undecided on the way in, 25% of you were against the proposition, and 65% of you were in favour of the proposition. At the end of proceedings tonight, the vote moved a little, but not significantly. Undecided was reduced to only 2%. 27% of you were against the proposition, and 71% of you were for the proposition. I find for the affirmative team.